Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session for Economist Impact's fourth annual Commercializing Quantum Global. Today, we'll be exploring how businesses are adapting and preparing themselves for a quantum future in a discussion titled Building Quantum Ready Organizations, Culture, Leadership, and Capability for a New Computing Era. My name is Shivangi Jain, and I'm a Senior Manager and Global Economic Modeling Lead at Economist Impact. And I'm very excited to be here today to moderate this discussion. Before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Deloitte Consulting, for their support for this webinar. And thank you to everyone joining us to listen into this discussion. I hope you enjoy the conversation and gain some insightful takeaways. So, quantum computing may still seem distant for many, but for forward-thinking leaders, the journey doesn't start when the first quantum application arrives. It starts now. With global investment in quantum technologies accelerating, it's clear that the shift is already underway. The real question now is, how do we prepare for it? And that preparation isn't only technical. It's about culture, leadership, and most importantly, it's about people. So how do we align the executive vision with long-term innovation? How do we upskill teams when the technology is still taking shape? And how do we create organizational cultures that are resilient, experimental, and ready to engage with this uncertainty? In today's panel, we'll tackle these questions and many more. We'll hear insights on how organizations can begin building capability, fostering internal champions, and setting strategic vision for a quantum future, even if they're still early on that adoption curve. Joining me today over the next hour, I'm very excited to introduce you to our panel, leaders from across sectors who are not only shaping the conversation around quantum, but actively building the foundations for what a quantum-ready organization looks like in practice. So with me today, I have Scott Buckles, Global Lead for Quantum Computing and Chief Technology Officer, Government and Public Services at Deloitte Consulting. Daniel Lidar, Viterbi Professor of Engineering at University of Southern California. Worley, Founder and Chief Executive at Strangeworks. And Lara Jahai, Chief Research Information Officer at Cleveland Clinic. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining me today. Before we get started, if I could just go around and ask all of you to tell the audience just a little bit about your background as it relates to quantum computing. Scott, maybe if I could start with you first on the top left of my screen.
Sure. It's nice to meet you all. Scott Buckholz. I, as Shivangi mentioned, lead Deloitte's efforts to explore quantum computing. And what that means for us is trying to understand sort of the who, what, when, where, why, and how of quantum computing, where our goal is to actually help our clients be able to utilize the software and hardware and algorithms to solve problems that are of interest to them, and also help them on the journey figuring out how to get from here to there.
Thank you, Scott. Lara, over to you.
Thank you. It's also great to be with everyone. My job for Cleveland Clinic is to lead information and bridge the gaps between technology and biomedical research. So under that purview, we have been investing quite heavily over the past few years now to define the applications of quantum computing as it pertains to healthcare and life sciences. As the technology evolves, we are working to build the workforce around it and upskill our teams. So very much looking forward to having that conversation with the rest of you.
Thank you, Lara. Daniel.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Lidar. I'm a professor of electrical engineering, chemistry, and physics at the University of Southern California, USC. I'm also the director of our Center for Quantum Information Science and Technology, and our two other centers. One is the USC IBM Quantum Innovation Hub, and the USC Lockheed Martin Quantum Computing Center. And my role is to do both research and teaching. I have been involved in quantum computing research since around 1995.
Thank you, Daniel, and welcome. And last but not least, Worley.
Yes, I'm Worley. I am the co-founder and the CEO of StrangeWorks, which is a quantum computing software company based here in Austin, Texas. We provide access to all of the quantum computers online, except for a couple of the ones that are still in research mode, so that clients can easily access these computers through an AI interface that abstracts all of the physics and math needed to use them and makes it where any subject matter expert at a company can use them. I've also was the founder of the IEEE Quantum Computing Standards Working Group, as well as a Linux Foundation project, the Global Quantum Initiative, and I've written 2 books, the Quantum Computing for Babies, which is very popular, and Quantum Computing for Dummies with Wiley, working on a 3rd book on the subject now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Worley, and thank you again to all of you, and welcome to this conversation. I guess before we dive into the core topic for today, which is around how businesses, universities, other institutions should prepare for quantum, I'd like to start with perhaps the more fundamental question, which is why? So, Laura, maybe if I could come to you first. And my question to you is quantum computing still mostly hype? Or are we starting to see real-world applications that are emerging outside of academia and more theoretical settings?
A great question to start with. I think the answer to it is very much in the eye of the beholder, I would say, where what do you define as a real-world application comes in. If you're a commercial entity that is used to, take drug discovery in our world, for example, your expectation is that you have a platform that you can run modeling of the whole protein on the way it is done now on classical computers. That is not going to be possible. And if you're going to wait for that to happen, you're going to wait for a long time before you explore quantum. But if your question is quantum now ready to do certain things that are not possible through classical computing? And is it now the right time to explore what is the place of quantum computing in the discovery world? Then I think the technology is there to allow us to ask meaningful questions. And we are very hopeful with progress that our teams have been making that we will be able to demonstrate these areas of utility or advantage over the next year or 2.
Thank you, Laura. Worley, I'd like to come to you next because I guess you kind of come at it from the other perspective, which is around sort of development of the technologies and working with your clients and other businesses to kind of integrate it within their practices. So from your perspective, do you see quantum as driving broader digital or organizational transformation that we haven't fully quite anticipated just yet?
Well, that's a great question. I believe that, we're at a very unique moment in time. Quantum computing is outside, unless you want to count neuromorphic or a couple other experimental technologies, the first real step away from the way we've done computing since the invention of computing. And so when I think of organizational transformation, I think of preparing for quantum just like we try to get organizations to prepare for the internet or to prepare for AI or any of these other technological changes. And so, when we work with an organization, a lot of times it's from the innovation department. So they're looking to get ahead and kind of figure out what's next for an organization. A lot of times it's with an actual tactical group within an organization. So, for example, we've worked with pharmaceutical companies that have used quantum computing in an effort to improve peptide discovery and workflow. And, as Laura said, there are limitations to this. A great example would be, we have an organization that we just took a massive data set from overseas on credit scoring, and we were able to eliminate biases in there using quantum convolutional neural networks. And it works, but you could also write a specific classical solver to do that same thing right now, right? So you're at this kind of, quantum isn't behind anymore. It's now kind of even. And as Laura stated, I thought very, very well put, we need to see an advantage, right, to really see the adoption, to really see things driving. And as you prepare for that as an organization, it's important to know you can't take a software developer and turn them into a quantum software developer overnight. I know because this was the original intention of my Linux Foundation project that eventually became StrangeWorks. And it's very hard for developers. And so we don't have as many abstraction layers as we have in classical computing. A good way to look at it from an organizational standpoint might be that with classical computing, when a developer is using making an iPhone app for a Cleveland Clinic or somewhere, they don't need to know how all of the electrons are happening during all the transistors. But when you're using quantum computing right now, you kind of do need to know what's happening down at that gate level. And so this level of complexity and this lack of, abstraction is something that's going to be a barrier for organizations transforming into quantum-ready organizations. And I fear that, while we've had 125 years of quantum mechanics and we've had, decades of people working on quantum computing like architectures, I fear that the uptick will be kind of like a ChatGPT moment in quantum, where all of a sudden we will have the discovery, we'll figure out the error correction, there'll be fault tolerance, these machines will progress much, much faster. And when that happens, if your organization hasn't already been looking at this, you're going to face a lot of barriers to being able to adopt it and take advantage of it.
Thank you, Worley. And I do want to come back to some of those barriers that you're talking about in a minute. But just, I guess, building on what you've been talking about and what Lara was talking about as well. Scott, maybe if I could come to you, because I guess you bring a sort of broader perspective on this, working across a range of clients in different sectors. Are you, from your perspective, seeing examples of quantum initiatives catalyzing sort of wider transformation efforts across digital, data, IT systems, like Worley was talking about earlier?
I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that. Part of the challenge is, at the moment, there are a lot of technologies that are competing for people's attention, right? Worley mentioned the large language models and other things. And, a little bit to what people are alluding to, until quantum solves a concrete problem materially better than classical technologies, and that could happen in the next year or two or three in the initial places, depending on whose roadmap you believe and who winds up getting the timing right, then, this is an interesting discussion for most organizations, because most organizations plan, candidly, for the next quarter, not for the next couple of years. And I would, foot stomp one of the things that Worley said, which is it does take a year or two to take somebody from being a developer to being a proficient quantum developer or quantum information scientist on some level. And it is entirely conceivable, and perhaps even likely, that we do wind up with a moment that we saw in machine learning and data science 10 to 15 years ago. So for those of us who have enough white hair and remember that transition, suddenly people realized that deep learning models and neural networks were actually a thing that could do really interesting work. Sort of fast forward today, it's the large language models. But at the time, it was predictive models and fraud detection and other things. What wound up happening was the knowledge you needed to operate close to the bare metal of building those models was incredibly high. And there were only a handful of experts globally who knew how to do it. They wound up becoming very concentrated in a small number of organizations. Those organizations could then attract the best talent because they had the best talent, and people wanted to go work with people they were going to learn from. And there was this talent constraint. And it is, I would submit, entirely likely that we will see a similar talent constraint going forward, and that the organizations who've made the decision to actually get into this now, with the anticipation that it is a longer term investment than a quarter, will be the ones who have the best ability to attract that talent in the future.
Thank you, Scott. That's an interesting perspective on the kind of divergence between short-term planning and long-term planning and how businesses go about thinking about that. I'd be interested, Daniel, to get your perspective from an academic angle here, because I guess a lot of it does start with academia in terms of developing these technologies and then taking them forward into a commercialized setting. So from your academic kind of standpoint, are you seeing sort of engagement with quantum more widely? And are you seeing that sort of spark more research and innovation at an academic level?
So the quantum computing, of course, started as a purely academic undertaking. In the early 80s, Feynman talked about simulating quantum mechanics on a quantum computer. And at that time, there was just paper and pen type discussion. And it lasted until the mid 90s when Peter Shor invented the factoring algorithm. And then it took another decade or so before we started to see actual functional small scale systems. All of that was essentially academic work. And academia continues to play a major role here. It has really defined the different types of algorithmic directions that quantum computers can excel in. And I think it might be useful for this discussion to just talk briefly about what the promise of quantum computing actually is. We've talked about applications, but well before applications, we have some academically motivated insights into where quantum computers can actually outperform classical computing, which is what this is all about, right? This is all, at the end of the day, it's about attaining what we call quantum advantage. And so we know that quantum computers are particularly good at certain tasks, most famously factoring integers. That was Shor's discovery that led to the explosion in quantum computing as we know it now. But actually, before that, I mentioned Feynman. Quantum simulation is really the original thrust that quantum computing drove. And that was the idea that you can simulate quantum systems more efficiently on quantum computers than you can otherwise. And that is now, in my opinion, still the most promising application, as a matter of fact. So the problem of simulating quantum mechanics itself is something that quantum computers are particularly good at. And that's perhaps not surprising, although it took a lot of hardcore computer science and physics theorem proving style work to show that indeed quantum computers are better than classical computers at this task. And why would you care? If you can simulate quantum mechanics, then you can presumably do some amazing things, like discovering new types of materials, perhaps one day a room temperature superconductor, which is the holy grail of condensed matter physics and would completely revolutionize the energy grid, among many other things. You might be able to simulate drug discovery on a quantum computer and discover new pharmaceuticals. Quantum chemistry as a whole is a very enticing target for quantum computing. And then there's quantum optimization, which is something that a lot of financial institutions are particularly interested in, because you could imagine designing a stock portfolio while taking into account all sorts of important constraints. And this optimization problem is something that we speculate, and we don't really know as well as we do for quantum simulation, that quantum computers might be able to help with. So I essentially listed three areas, right? So code breaking, quantum simulation, quantum optimization, and there are several others. And all these are areas that are being explored for quantum applications nowadays. But as the previous speakers have noted, we're not quite there yet. And the reasons for that are interesting, and is something we could dive into as well. But the state where we're in currently is we have small scale quantum devices that can do proof of principle type calculations, but are still not quite ready to solve real world problems. And we're all working very hard to achieve that goal.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And I think hearing all of you speak, it's clear that there's a lot of different potential use cases and applications for quantum, but it's not quite yet at the point where it can be commercialized. And so I guess the question is, how do we bridge that gap and get businesses and other institutions to start to prepare for something which is a little bit uncertain at this point? Scott, I guess building on something that you were talking about a little earlier on, if the technology is still so nascent and experimental, what kinds of culture and leadership shifts might be needed to help businesses prepare? How do you convince someone at C-suite level to invest in something that we don't really know what the full returns might be of yet? So I guess, Scott, you work, as I said previously, you work across a range of different industries and with organizations across the breadth of that. What kinds of leadership behaviors are you seeing that helps them stay ahead of the curve and sort of preempt quantum and the impact it might have?
I think the most enlightened organizations, in some sense, view investing in quantum computing today as a bit of this analogy works well in financial services, as a call option or an insurance policy against a quantum eventually becoming this truly transformative technology. The challenge is humans are really bad at predicting how exponential technologies basically grow in terms of capacity and scale. One example that isn't a perfect example is actually if you think about the transition from film cameras to digital cameras. The original digital cameras were not very compelling. If you can look back 20 years to the pictures that your phones took, you'd realize that they weren't particularly good pictures. Yet what wound up happening is that technology kept getting exponentially better to the point where film is now something that's used more for art purposes than for most practical purposes. And while quantum computers are not likely to replace classical computers by any stretch of the imagination, they are likely to be a useful complement for certain problems. And it's entirely conceivable that certain problems will never use classical computing at some point in the future. In the same way that hardly anybody uses CPUs alone to train large language models these days, you could envision a world where certain classes of problems are just done by default on quantum machines. And because of the nature of exponential growth, that timeline may actually happen sooner rather than later, and sooner than people think. If you graph the capacity of the devices, right, as Daniel was saying, they can't yet, they're still doing proof of principle problems, and their capacity does continue to double every 18 to 24 months across vendors if you put them on a graph. So, that means that 10 years from now, you have things that are 32 times bigger. Suddenly you start talking about sizes and scales that actually can start solving meaningful problems, and you blink and that doubles and doubles and doubles. And so that's why this is an important consideration for people to be thinking about. And at the point where you decide that this is in fact potentially a transformative technology for my industry, then you back up from there and say, okay, when do we need to start? What does that need to look like, right? Is this an insurance policy? Is this a call option in case quantum goes to the moon? But companies are comfortable thinking about those kinds of decisions because those kinds of decisions get made in all sorts of other places today.
Thank you, Scott. Laura, maybe if I could come to you just to build on that and provide a bit more, I guess, of the health sector lens on that. Are some of those shifts that Scott has been talking about, are you seeing that in the health sector? And if not, what kinds of leadership shifts do you think are needed to prepare for the potential for quantum in the sector?
Yes, Shivangi. Well, as someone who has had to go to the C-suite and convince them to invest in quantum computing, I have many stories, to tell around this. But for the purposes of background for the audience, Cleveland Clinic is now the only healthcare system in the world that has a quantum computer on site. We have now a 127, soon to be the Heron chip in a couple of months, a quantum IBM system that is installed in the middle of our biomedical research facility, which is right across from our hospital. So when we talk about adopting quantum computing, I don't think you could go further than that in the context of an industry. If we look back at the time when we made that decision, that was in 2021 when Cleveland Clinic had turned 100 years old. That's important because we were at a time point where we were looking 100 years ahead. So what Scott mentioned earlier about the organizations thinking in terms of quarters, that is not the mindset of an organization that's going to invest in quantum. We had that long-term view in mind. The other differentiator when leadership factors in is that you have to be in the mindset of thinking of your present, how do I maintain my operations going? I have to bring in the revenue, my bread and butter, what defines me as an organization. I have to be able to deliver on, so I cannot be experimenting with something that's going to risk me doing my job, right? So I have to continue my infrastructure, my day-to-day operations. But if that's all I'm doing, I will be obsolete very soon. The digital camera example that was mentioned is perfect in the sense that the companies that didn't actually cannibalize their own business by investing in the digital technology ended up going out of business because other companies looked at that, developed it, and then became the leaders in that field. So the point here is that as a leader of an organization, your job is to protect your current customers, in our case, our current patients, but also work towards how do we do the best care for our patients of tomorrow, the future generation. And for that, we have to invest now in those technologies of the future. We heard it said in many different ways how long it takes to develop that talent, much more eloquently than I could say it. The way I usually say it is that quantum knowledge is not like the Holy Spirit descending overnight on a bunch of people and then, they know how to do quantum. It takes a little bit longer than that. So it is that the key leadership trait that I think makes a difference here when it comes to quantum is that long-term, that ability to see long-term and optimism. You have to be optimistic because it's very difficult, but at the same time, you have to be realistic and being able to walk that line between the present and the future every single day. And that's what's going to differentiate the organizations that survive versus not.
Thank you, Laura. And that's so exciting to hear about Cleveland Clinic's first quantum computer. And I think really interesting lessons to learn from a leadership perspective in terms of needing to have that long-term vision to enable that. Really, I'd be really interested to hear from you in terms of how you have these conversations with organizations that you take quantum technologies to. How do you sort of bring them along that journey? Is it similar things to what Laura was talking about? Are there other kind of conversations that you have to get them excited about quantum?
Yeah, there's a number of conversations. I mean, for us, it's pretty simple. If you have a business that uses computers, and if you use those computers for machine learning or optimization or some form of simulation, which is almost every business, then you need to be up to speed on this, right? For us, we are in a unique position. The StrangeWorks platform allows our customers to run on CPUs, GPUs, TPUs, and QPUs, among other things. And so there's a much easier return on investment. You know, as Daniel said, and Scott and Laura both mentioned, you're in this early stage. And so the approach we take is when we run something for a company or we tell them, here's what you need to do to adapt, we're able to do that across the entire compute spectrum so that they can actually benchmark and compare and see where the solution that are quantum based fall in that. And so I think, you know, for us, we don't do any marketing. The baby's book is primarily our only marketing. We've spoken at a few conferences and done some stuff. It's mostly inbound. And so, you know, two factors come into that. One, there's over 100 of the Fortune 500 companies using quantum computing today in some form. Yes, that's mainly experimental and kind of, you know, fact searching and trying to figure out where it falls in. But in addition to that, there's some legitimate work, and there's some things in optimization of train repair logistics. Figuring out when you're going to have certain parts scheduled or certain maintenance scheduled. Airport logistics for terminals. There are things where this is starting to be used more and more. It's still used alongside a classical solution, but I think when you have 100 companies in the Fortune 100 using it, when you have actual examples where you can show where it's being used, again, you know, I gave that example of the getting the bias out of the data set. Sure, you could write a classical solver to do that as or more efficiently today, but when a business can see, okay, this is classical, this is the quantum, and then here's kind of highly optimized classical, and kind of get their bearings, setting that kind of where they're at in the evolution of quantum, I think that's really, really useful to them. Most of our traffic is inbound, and I have to say we have more inbound traffic now than we can handle. So I think businesses have woken up. You look at the public stock markets and you say, what stocks are kind of always leading the market? It's tech stocks. And now you have publicly traded quantum companies. Now, there's an argument that they shouldn't be, that there's not enough market. But the fact that they're there and the fact that Wall Street is now taking interest is permeating quantum through the Global 2000 at a much faster rate than you saw just a couple of years ago. And so, you know, whereas 10 years ago, I had to explain the difference between a bit and a qubit as an opening. 5 years ago, I'd explained that they weren't really computers as a software developer, but they were more really great equipment for exploring the quantum landscape, kind of like Daniel hinted to. 3 years ago, you were talking about what types of machines there were and what, you know, white papers had said and what the work had been done. You know, this year, people are already, look, we know we need a quantum strategy. We want to be doing something with it. Here's our problem set. Where can you show us what could work and what not? And that's what we do. You know, the future of computing is obviously heterogeneous, but it is quantum first, and quantum has a huge role to play. As Daniel described, there are a myriad of intractable problems that aren't suitable for classical. So there's so much opportunity space. And when you look at, you know, things like what the World Economic Forum is pushing with the quantum economy and what many of the governments are doing and why they're investing, it's no longer just about, oh, it could break encryption, it's national security. It's moved to a quantum economy both on a national level and on even a state level. Here in Texas, we recently passed through the House and Senate a Texas Quantum Initiative, specifically built to help businesses based in the state get ahead on quantum and adopt it earlier and faster because they see this coming. So I think, the conversation has changed over the years from, oh, what is quantum mechanics to, who's using it to, okay, let's talk about my specific situation in my business. Where can it help? Where can it not? Where are the problems too big for the number of qubits we have? Where are there things where we might be able to use things like quantum convolutional neural nets and actually use them as part of a pre or post processing in what we're doing? So it's a very different conversation today. And I have to say, an incredibly easier conversation. Even since Scott and I met each other through this community, I think he would agree. The conversations are very different today than they were. You still have to temper expectations. There's still a lot of hype in the industry. You still have to get people, and that's where StrangeWorks has built our brand on kind of being the honest broker of where the technology really is from a business perspective. So there's still expectation setting that needs to be done. However, the conversation is much, much easier. I interview 100 CIOs and CTOs every year as a matter of trying to keep up on the pulse of where business is. And, the budgets were zero 3 years ago. Now almost everyone has some budget. It's small, but there's some distinct, guided, purposeful effort to explore quantum computing or work quantum computing in the future planning. And as Scott mentioned, it's future-proofing your company. Not using quantum computing as part of your strategic planning would be the equivalent of Barnes and Noble saying, why do we need an internet site? We have stores on every corner. Or, Steve Ballmer saying, what, the iPhone's going to be on one carrier? That sounds ridiculous. There's been these big technological shifts that so many people have missed. And when you look at the investment by countries around the world, by governments, you see this need to say, look, a lot of places missed out on the internet. A lot of companies missed out on the early internet. A lot of companies missed out on, mobile forward, all these other trends. Now people want to be, not just on the AI trend you see emerging, but on the quantum trend. And I think there's a big argument of how those two are actually going to work together. I see AI as the interface for quantum computing for most of the people that will use it in the future. So I think it's an easy conversation now. The question is, how long will that conversation remain easy before people need to see demonstrable proof of quantum advantage? It's been mentioned several times by the other speakers. And if we don't find a rubber meets the road moment in the next 2 or 3 years, I believe we will, then you could lose that interest and it could fall into, I don't want to call it a quantum winter, but, business might take another 5 years to come back around and say, okay, now we're willing to invest in that again.
Thank you, Worley. And that evolution of the sort of journey that businesses have gone on that you just described, from sort of initial stages of trying to understand what it means, maybe a little bit of skepticism, to now thinking about what it could mean for them specifically, to now wanting to see applications of it, is really interesting. And Daniel, coming to you, I wonder what role academia plays now in that next step of that evolution and journey. Are you seeing anything on that front, and how are universities and research institutions sort of helping to shape leadership mindsets to embrace quantum transformation and show some of those potential impacts it could have in a more commercialized setting?
Yeah, so when Laura mentioned the IBM machine at the Cleveland Clinic, it reminded me that, in fact, in 2011, USC was the first institution to obtain a commercial quantum computer. And that was the D-Wave machine, which Lockheed Martin acquired for USC, and is still the basis of one of our 3 quantum centers. So we've academia, in that sense, has driven commercial activity in quantum computing since 2011. And that was sort of the beginning of the commercialization of quantum computing as we know it now. That was the very first sale of a quantum system to any institution outside of the companies that built these machines. Regarding demonstrable proof of quantum advantage that Worley mentioned, which I think is what we're all really hoping to see. There are some really interesting results in that regard. I would like to highlight some work that actually came out of my own group just a few days ago. Using the IBM machines, we were able to demonstrate for the first time an exponential quantum advantage on hardware. Now, this is not for an application type problem. This is for a problem that at best you could use to win a sort of a guessing game. Think of Jeopardy. So it's not something that is going to let you discover high temperature or room temperature superconductors. But nevertheless, it is actually a real demonstration of an indisputable quantum exponential advantage that's grounded in computer science in the sense that we can provide a theoretical proof that classically one cannot do better. So this is one example of a recent trend that we've seen of experiments that actually show that the era of quantum advantage has already arrived. It's a bit of a tug of war between classical computing and quantum computing, because when somebody makes a claim about a quantum advantage, usually there is going to be some group that is grounded in classical computing and that will try to tear it down. And it's a very productive type of tug of war. But in this case, we actually used an algorithm for which it is known that there is no better classical type of algorithm that is even possible. So we actually have a kind of a brick wall separation between quantum and classical. Specifically, this is known as Simon's algorithm. It was one of the algorithms that inspired Peter Shor and led to the creation of the factoring algorithm. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, and we haven't talked about what is kind of the big elephant in the room, why we're still talking about small scale quantum computers and why we don't yet have massive quantum computers that are already delivering quantum advantage at an application level scale. And this has to do with the problem of decoherence, right? So this is the kind of the ugly word in quantum computing. Decoherence is the process through which quantum computers lose their quantum properties and become kind of classical. And in fact, they become worse than classical computers in the sense that a decoherent quantum computer just outputs essentially random noise. And if that's what it does, then you can easily simulate it with a classical computer. Well, if you can easily simulate your quantum computer classically, then why bother building a quantum computer? So this is a problem that has been known since the very beginning, the decoherence problem, and also from the very beginning, people came up with clever ways to counter this problem, and this is known as quantum error correction. And the biggest thrust right now, beyond demonstrating algorithmic advantage using today's quantum computers, is quantum error correction. That's where the focus is of, I would say, more than half of research, and also a lot of the industry focus. If you look at companies like Google and IBM, they're spending tremendous resources on demonstrating quantum error correction. Quantum error correction is the tool that we have to beat down decoherence and let our quantum computers perform longer and longer calculations. We were talking earlier about the day when the exponential kind of catches up with us, and suddenly we see this transformative ChatGPT-like moment for quantum computing. Really, what that is about crossing a certain threshold in quantum error correction that will allow us to essentially compute indefinitely long. Right now, our quantum computers are just crashing way too fast because of decoherence. Decoherence is like noise, and that introduces errors. And as we develop more and more powerful and capable quantum error correction strategies, there will come a day, and it's hard to predict exactly when, but it's somewhere within probably the next 5 to 10 years, conservatively speaking, where we're going to cross this threshold and quantum computers will be able to carry out indefinitely long calculations. And when that day arrives, that is going to be our ChatGPT moment. That's the day when we will be able to eventually run application level quantum programs that are going to solve the hard problems that we cannot solve otherwise. So that's the moment that I'm looking forward to more than anything on this journey.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I'd like to shift the discussion slightly and think about the broader workforce and maybe build on a point I think Wally and Scott, you both mentioned sometime earlier in this discussion around we can't expect everyone to suddenly become quantum engineers or be able to understand how it works and be able to operate it. So I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, how should organizations be thinking about reskilling, talent pipelines, etc.? Scott, maybe coming to you, in your experience of sort of working across organizations, how are they approaching this challenge? Are they thinking about it more in terms of internally upskilling the people they have, or hiring externally, or a combination of both?
It's a combination of both. It depends on the organization. What I would say, maybe I'll share our journey as an organization. We decided that we had enough clients that were investing in quantum computing 5 years ago that we needed to be able to meet them where they were. And what we initially decided is, great, we will take a couple of people, we will train them. Once they're trained up, we'll figure out what all this stuff is about, and it's going to be great. So we sent people to a bunch of training. They came back, and they couldn't do a whole lot. And we spent a bunch of time trying to figure out what was going on. One of the individuals set a goal for themselves to write something that was not realistically feasible given their capabilities at the time, and got frustrated by the whole experience. And what we found was that we actually had to go back, and we had to actually hire somebody who was actually our current head of research, who is a computational material scientist who had experience working with quantum computers and high performance computers. And he was able to come and help the team actually understand, oh, you have to do it this way, not that way, right? They were accustomed to, I walk up to something, I pick up the tool, I turn the crank, everything works, ta-da. And, this was not that journey. And so basically from there, we've been building through a combination of hiring people with capability or transferring people with capability in and providing them additional training, supervised by a handful of people who know deeply what they're doing so that they can help our other people be successful. And I think the most successful companies are going to find they need at least some of that deep talent, right, that you can get from the USCs of the world and the other academic institutions, combined with people that they are upskilling, because there just isn't enough talent, in the academic field to satisfy the demand. So really, we have to get both things to work together. But what we found is one or the other really probably isn't sufficient either to scale or to be effective.
Thank you, Scott. Lara, maybe a similar question to you. Is your team sort of exploring internal quantum literacy, or as Scott said, is it a combination of internal skill development but supplemented with sort of external expertise coming through from academia?
It's important to do both, upskill internally and import talent. That's in this whole workforce development effort, I think there is two pieces that are absolutely essential. The first one is beyond what Scott mentioned. The first one is that when it comes to upskilling, it really needs to be bi-directional. What I mean by that is it is not enough to develop engineers and computer scientists and physicists who are great academicians in quantum computing, quantum information science, and expect quantum to have an impact in the real world. If those scientists just stay within the realm of academia, then they will be solving a lot of problems, but not necessarily the right kind of problems, right? So when you merge the academicians with the subject matter researchers, so like in my space, when I put the computer scientists and the engineers together with the biomedical researchers who are looking to solve the problems, literally put them together in the same space. That's why we put the machine in the middle of our research facility, so that those biomedical researchers see it all the time, question it all the time, get curious about it all the time. We had to do workshops and open houses and seminars with getting the engineers and the scientists on the quantum side to interact with those biomedical researchers. That's how the really useful questions came to be. And that's how we got to where we are right now, where we are finding we're publishing papers now almost every 2-3 weeks. We're publishing one where it is the first time that quantum computing did X when it comes to biomedical science. First times we're modeling specific chemical bonding when it comes to drug discovery. First time we are demonstrating quantum machine learning advantage over classical machine learning when it comes to processing imaging studies, for example. The questions that we're asking are the ones that we really care about. So in that sense, making progress becomes more meaningful, and you are upskilling both sides, the engineering side and the biomedical research side, so that those people can learn how to speak together and work together. The consequence that you get from doing these two things, the physical proximity and the bidirectional upskilling, are two measures of success. The one, what I mentioned about getting to problems that matter, not hypothetical problems that need solving. And the second advantage is the engagement. We put this machine here. The first 7 months, nobody was using it. And I would track, we track utilization on the machine, and I had to go to the C-suite and show that 0 does not look good with nobody taking advantage of it. But that time went into all of this education and workshop and exposures. And, then 8 months later, we were at about 60%. Now, a year and a half later, we're at 100%. And there's a line. And what we saw is that in that time, the shift that happened beyond the increase in utilization was the distribution of who's using it. Whereas at the beginning, it was mostly the IBM engineers and scientists. Right now, it is mostly the Cleveland Clinic researchers, where we have internal talent in quantum chemistry and quantum machine learning, but also some people that were upskilled, that started with classical in our biomedical labs. During that time, they learned from this internal talent, like Scott mentioned, and now they can do it on their own. So it takes patience to do all of this. Just continuing to push through, but it still takes us about 3 to 6 months, actually, on average, for any project to decide if this is a good for quantum research project or not when it comes to the medical applications. And there is no way to actually speed that up. We're trying. You do have to take the time to dissect your problems and analyze them. But you will get there if you have that openness of wanting to learn from the other discipline.
Thank you so much, Laura. And that's a really interesting perspective on how we can start to really think about commercializing quantum and combining those skill sets, both the sort of technical engineering side, but then thinking about what actually makes sense in practice and what are the problems you're actually trying to solve for using quantum. And you need to have that combination. So that's a very interesting perspective to put on the table. We are coming to the end of our hour. We have about 5 minutes left. Before we wrap up, I would just like to go around all of you one more time and ask each of you the same question this time. And that question is, what does it mean to be quantum ready in 2025? And how can organizations know that they are on the right track? Scott, maybe I can start with you on that.
Sure. I think the most important thing is that organizations at least have a plan. And that plan should include who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? Is quantum computing something that is likely to help in their organization? And if so, knowing the initial places and the subsequent places to look, that there's a who part of the strategy to understand how will the organization obtain the talent it needs and other things, basically just looking across. Because whether organizations say, hey, we believe that now is the time, and so we're going to invest, they still need help, as Worley pointed out, in figuring out, of my universe of problems, which one should I start with? And if they have decided that they want to be prepared, but they don't necessarily want to go all in today, it at least behooves them to know, what should we be looking for in the market? What are the signals that are going to tell us now is the time to push the accelerator pedal, and when can we just keep monitoring things? I think that many organizations assume that this is going to be like many technologies we've seen before. It will go by and they'll be able to run really fast to catch up. And that might be possible. And there's also a decent chance that this will be, in some ways, unlike some of the technologies where it was really easy to run behind and catch up. And that process, if you think about machine learning, took close to a decade. So it might not be the case that organizations can all afford to wait.
Thank you, Scott. Daniel, from your perspective, what does it mean to be quantum ready today?
Yeah, so at a university, of course, we've been quantum ready for a long time and will continue to be quantum ready, because what we do is we teach courses to our students, and we prepare the workforce that then goes and works for great companies like being represented on this call. So I guess that's the obvious part of the answer. But I'd like to add to that more and more of my colleagues and myself have become somewhat entrepreneurial. So I actually co-founded a startup called Quantum Elements, which is trying to build, you can think of it as a quantum operating system that connects the hardware layer to kind of low-level software applications with everything in between. And that's been a very interesting new experience for me as an academic, because well, first of all, the world of startups and entrepreneurship is a fascinating one, but also it's provided an entirely new paradigm for how to train our students. Quantum Elements employs a large number of interns. Those are graduate students who are looking for interesting things to do over the summer and beyond. And that is a new angle on how academic quantum work and research and training can take place. It is beyond the classroom. It's getting people ready through hands-on experience through internships like this. And I should mention that also I've had experience with a lot of students who went and interned for the more established companies in this area, which has been tremendously useful for them and for these companies where they ended up taking jobs. So those are examples of the kind of things that we're doing in academia nowadays to train the workforce and be quantum ready.
Thank you, Daniel. Laura, same question to you.
I'd say if as an organization you can point to your strategy to be quantum ready, you are very close to being quantum ready. If what you get is, a blank look, then you're not. From a more practical perspective, though, I think you can tell who's ready and who's not by looking to see who has a quantum ecosystem around them versus not. The organizations that may have like a little group that's internal to them that may have an interest in quantum, this is one extreme. But then when you have organizations that have programs for within their workforce, like Cleveland Clinic, for example, right now, we have our internal research program that is purely focused on quantum, all the examples I mentioned. But then in parallel to that, we have our relationships with universities where we have programs for their students to come rotate in our labs and vice versa. We have programs that foster startups to be moving to the Cleveland area to support our innovation district here. We support them with access to quantum and access to our scientists. We have relationships with foundations that we're partnering with to do the research. The educational exposure is all the way from the school level, middle school, high school, all the way to the postdocs in the labs. If you can point, and many other examples like that, but if you can point to an environment around the organization with partners from across that continuum, academia, education, industry, foundations, startups, etc., that are all have connections around quantum, that is a ready organization.
Thank you, Lara. And finally, over to you, Worley, for any last thoughts.
Well, I think that's a great question. How do you start a quantum ready organization? At StrangeWorks, we break it into 5 basic things. The first being awareness and education. So leadership needs to understand what it is, what it's not, how it could impact the business. The organization, as was just stated, needs to invest in internal education and workshops and kind of raise the quantum literacy up, if you will. The second is talent and partnerships. Hiring or upskilling quantum aware talent. Like, you may not need to hire a physicist, but maybe you have a mathematician familiar with quantum that's in your area of business, or a subject matter expert that's in that area. And then, of course, along with that, the partnerships of forming strategic partnerships. Maybe it's with a consultancy like Scott and Deloitte. Maybe it's with a university like Daniel, or an organization like Cleveland Clinic. But, starting to build things outside of the organization that can feed, information in and experience in. And then the third, fourth, and fifth are pretty standard, right? Exploring use cases. So what can you experiment with in that area? Integrating quantum into your infrastructure. As I stated at StrangeWorks, almost all of our customers have a hybrid classic quantum approach. So we run across the spectrum, and they're able to use that service to basically prepare their data architectures and software systems to integrate quantum process and evaluate where it's at for their organization. And then the last thing, fifth and final but not last, is strategic planning and roadmaps, which I think everybody's kind of touched on, which is, quantum needs to be part of the long-term innovation strategy to company. And that goes all the way up to the board and C-suite leaders, monitoring developments, allocating budget, including quantum in the horizon scanning and risk models they build for their business. So I think, those 5 things, having the awareness and education, building the talent partnerships, doing the use case exploration, integrating it with your infrastructure, and then including it in your strategic planning, that really prepares an organization for being quantum ready in 2025. Because I, again, think that this is going to happen for most organizations in a seemingly almost overnight change, and they're going to be left behind. And so I'd encourage everyone to start doing those 5 things in their organizations today.
Thank you so much, Worley. Well, we are over time, but I just want to end by saying a big thank you to all of you for this really thoughtful discussion. I think we've covered a lot of ground, getting past the initial question of, is it still all a hype, to talking about leadership, culture, capabilities, etc. And I hope it's given our audience a lot to reflect on. So a big thank you to all of you, Scott, Daniel, Worley, and Lara, for sharing your insights. And thank you so much to everyone tuning in. Goodbye.